So the big question is this: how do real estate investors who don't have a ton of free time, don't have access to off-market deals, and didn't start life on third base, how do we conservatively grow our real estate business to support our families, finally leave the corporate rat race, and build a legacy? That is the question, and this podcast will give you the answers. I'm Ed Matthews, and this is Real Estate Underground. Greetings and salutations, Real Estate Undergrounders. It is Ed Matthews with the Real Estate Underground. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today is, once again, a really cool episode. I am joined by Shannon Robnett. He is the president and CEO, omnipotent supreme being of Shannon Robnett Industries. Shannon, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Hey, thanks, Ed. And I think it's appropriate to mention I am in the basement of my building. I did my part to join the underground.
There you go. Hey, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. So in terms of, I know your story because you and I have been linked on LinkedIn for quite some time. And I think we know a couple hundred people, overlap in terms of your world and my world. For those of us out there that don't know who you are, why don't you lay out who you are and what you do for a living?
Yeah. And I was born at a very young age into a real estate family. And so I didn't have a lot of choices. Saturdays were going to job sites, cleaning up around the houses, around the industrial buildings my father was building. My mother was a third generation real estate broker. I went on to get my license. My son, who's 27, has his license as well. And I thought I wanted to do something different. I saw the hard work involved in building things. And I went to college and I saw that studying was harder for me. And I also watched my brother right out of high school building houses. And in 1993, he made about $47,000 that year, which was a king's ransom for, kid with no education. So I promptly dropped out of college, went and told my dad I wanted to build houses. And his first response was, let's go get the backhoe. And literally we built houses. We could build 3 houses a year. And I quickly realized that was the hard work I wanted to avoid. And so I learned to scale that business. And we built everything from city halls to fire stations, to hospitals, to medical facilities, to schools, you name it, we built it. And I saw in that evolution, Ed, that when I was done building the building, I had to go find another project. I had to go find something else because the money didn't come in every month.
Right.
And at about that same time, I watched my parents retire at 50 years old with cash flow. And over the course of their construction, they had been building, but they had also been keeping some. And they had a portfolio of industrial properties that have afforded them the exact same lifestyle today, 23 years later, that they had when they retired, because with inflation, with the, price increases, rent increases, they've been able to live that same life. And in 2001, I built my first industrial complex for myself. I did that as a single check writer. I was the only guy standing there. And by the time I got done, I almost bled to death.
Yeah.
And, I think everyone in your audience has been down that road, right? Where you take on something and, oh my goodness, it hurts. And then you remember what cash flow was, like laying on a desert island and remembering what ice was like, it was not fun. Yeah. But I began to build a real estate portfolio. And I also learned that if I helped other people make money, they would help me with my projects. And so for the next 12 years or so, I worked with single check writers. They would bring the money. I would bring the project. We would do the deal. And at the end of that venture, whatever it was decided to be, we would part ways and everybody would be more profitable. And along that road, I just saw that, as my projects kept getting bigger, my dependency on capital became greater. And in 2019, I stuck my toes in the syndication world. And for those of your listeners that don't know, syndication is just a really fancy word for partnership. And that partnership allowed me to move through larger projects. It allowed me to involve investors with as little as $50,000 in $80 million projects. And it allowed an avenue for both parties to be very successful and to get to the goal that they wanted to get to. And that was important for me because I was able to advance my companies, but I was also able to provide something that people were looking for, the ability to be involved in real estate, to take advantage of all the tax benefits without having to get out there and figure out which piece of land to buy, what kind of building to build, what rents to charge, all of those kinds of things. And so here I am today. In the last 3.5 years, we've raised about $64 million in syndicated capital, and we're currently involved in projects in 6 different states.
So when you go to raise capital, let's start there. Is it predominantly work? Obviously, you've been doing this for a while. You have a tremendous reputation. So I would imagine a lot of people come to you, but in terms of creating that relationship with the investor, obviously there's the awareness piece, and then you've got to build trust. And that usually comes down to serving them in some way or another. And at some point in that relationship, you're in the right to do business, right? And, walk me through your process in terms of, hey, you just met Ed Matthews and he's an accredited investor and he's thinking about investing, but doesn't quite know, what to do yet.
Ed, you would be an anomaly as an accredited investor. Most of our investors are non-accredited. And what that means is that they either have a net worth less than $1 million, or as a single person, they make $200,000 annually, or as a couple make $300,000 annually. And the difference with that is the ability to advertise. And we won't really go into that. But the reality is the thing that I think I do well is help educate. So we just met. First thing I would want to know is, Ed, what type of investor are you? Are you a cash flow investor? Are you an appreciation investor? Or are you a tax-centric investor? Because there's really 3 stages of your life that you come into as an investor, and it unfortunately or fortunately, it has a lot to do with your age, right?
Yeah.
So as a 20 to 35-year-old, you're looking for appreciation because 6% cash on 100 grand isn't going to buy you much more than fuel in this economy. And then as you progress and you become more skilled at your craft and you get into a $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year income, now all of a sudden taxes become your priority, because giving away 100 grand every year to our favorite aunts and uncles in Washington isn't anybody's idea of a good time. And so that becomes the reason that real estate becomes much more attractive. And in the later stages of your life, when you're focusing on how to get out of your JOB, how to walk away and live the life that you've always dreamed of, you get to be more of a tax or a cash flow person that's looking at, okay, now I've grown that portfolio. I've done it in a tax advantaged way. And now I'm sitting with enough that 6% cash on cash does work. But my goodness, the last thing I want to be as a landlord, how can I accomplish that goal?
Right.
And so we help people through that. And in that education process, we're really able to, in my opinion, build that trust, because I don't really have anything to sell you. I honestly don't. I have opportunities that if you understand them and you find value in what I'm offering, we could be great partners.
100% agree with that.
If those 2 things aren't there, then it's really difficult for us to have a relationship where it's symbiotic and it's good, right?
Yeah, it's so true. And that's the thing, with folks that I meet that are just starting out, I get the classic 3 answers when I say, what's stopping you? It's, I can't find the deals. I don't have time because I work 80 hours a week and I've got responsibilities. And then the third one is, I don't know where to get the money to fund it. And, the money part is interesting because there's a mindset shift that has to happen there. And because you're not asking for money, you're offering an opportunity to help them get to wherever they're trying to go on their financial journey. And it's a very different conversation. There's 0 sales involved.
Yeah. And, this is the thing, Ed, I grew up, like I said, in a real estate household. I've never known anything but real estate. And when you talk to somebody who's, grew up in a car dealership family, all they understand is cars, and they understand them really well, and they understand what ones are valuable and this and that. But, the thing that we've all been programmed, and I do say programmed, is that there are 2 things in life. There's death and taxes. I would argue that there's only one of those, because if you play the real estate game properly, as most of your listeners know, it's a very tax advantaged game. Indeed. And when you do that, you begin to compound your ability to make future investments. We were able to help the average person save a tremendous amount, in some cases 100% of what they were paying last year in taxes, and create tax-free cash flow that then allows them to invest faster and build more and have, that snowball effect happen, so that at the end of the day, they're living a tax-free life or really close to a tax-free life. And they're doing it even if they have a full-time job, and they're able to do it in a way that makes sense for them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I get it's an interesting approach because most people don't fundamentally understand the whole concept of depreciation and accelerated depreciation. And, the fact is that you can wipe out most, if not all, of the cash flow that's flowing in. And that's assuming that it's going into your regular, either brokerage account or bank account. When you get into the retirement world, it's, just as compelling because you can use your self-directed IRA to invest in real estate in a passive way. You're not pushing any paintbrushes. You're not collecting rents. And it allows you to grow, tax advantaged. I don't want to say tax free, until you're ready to draw, which is really powerful.
And, the other thing too, Ed, one of the things that I do every year, and I really encourage people that there's a lot of people out there doing, a lot of people get into real estate started with the wholesaling, right? That's the question. Answer the question, how do I get the money? I don't ever have to own it, but I get paid on it. And I think that's the hardest, literally the hardest thing to do, because you're looking for a needle in a haystack. And then once you find it, you're going to look for another needle in another haystack and link those two up and have a sale.
Yeah.
But then they go from that, they go to fix and flip, then they do the BRRRR strategy, then they go to, multiple units and all that stuff. But what I tell people is I say, pull out your tax return. If you're a W-2 employee, pull out your tax return. If you're a business owner and you own a detail shop or a cabinet manufacturing shop, pull out your tax return and then divide your gross income by 52 weeks and then divide it again by 40 hours in that week. And that is your billable rate, right? So if you just think about that, you're going to go buy a new house, right? You're going to buy a new rental property and you're going to spend 40 hours by the time you get with a realtor, find it, locate it, do those kinds of things. That is what you're spending to be the owner of that home as far as what your time is worth. Yeah. Then every time you go change a light bulb, deal with a water heater because you're going to save money on property management, all of those conversations continue to happen where people don't realize what their time is worth. And when you really do get a hold of that concept, a lot of people make a lot of different decisions based on real estate because they realize that real estate can be just buying another job.
Absolutely. The fact is that, we go through this process every quarter, me and my team. So I have a bunch of VAs that are in the Philippines. And then obviously we've got our, management and construction folks. And so we go through this process of, what's stressing us out and what's working really well. And the stuff that stresses us out, we do one of, a handful of things, right? We're either looking to automate it, we're looking to delegate it, we're looking to outsource it, or we just stop freaking doing it because it's, the last thing that, I wanted to do when I started this. And we have, we're much smaller than you, but we own our multifamily properties. We have a management team in-house. And then, obviously we have contractors that handle the break fix and maintenance and all that. But, the last thing I want to do, A, because I'm not as qualified as the guys that work for us. But B, I look at, my rate, to use your example, I can't be spending time doing a, $30, $40 an hour job because the value I bring to the company is way more than that. And so I got to do the stuff that I do, which is, meet investors and find new deals.
And, that's very well said too, because, I don't know how your company runs, but if the cabinet door has to be fixed and I have to do it, we're going to need to fix it again. I can do it, but I'm going to get there and I'm going to have a straight slot instead of a Phillips. And then I'm going to go to Home Depot. And then there's going to be an ambulance involved, but it's really about understanding what do you do best? Yeah. I've got quite a few doctors and attorneys that are investors, and what they do is bill out at $600 an hour.
Right.
And they know and understand that world. And I have two things that I do for them. One is I provide them with tax benefits, and two, I stay the heck out of their way so they can bill $600 an hour. And those are the things that we're able to do. And just like you, I am the highest and best use of their time. So where they're going, when I need legal advice, I don't go to Wikipedia. I call them, or when I'm not feeling well, I go see them because they're specialized in that area. And so many people think that they have to be the answer to their own problem. And in doing that, they typically cause maybe a bit bigger problem by being able to, not take advantage of certain things. They don't have the free time. They missed the kids' soccer game because they were replacing, a ceiling fan or something like that. And when you really look at that, everything costs money. What's my highest and best use? You really get a really great equation for where you spend your time in life, let alone real estate.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, there's a book, and I'm sure you've read it because you're speaking basically right from the same hymnal as Who Not How, right? Dan Sullivan.
I love that book.
Yeah, me too. I read it a couple of times. I read it at least once a year to remind myself, because I'm that control freak who will be like, whose my propensity is towards, it's okay, I'll do it. That's not, right. And that whole delegation, automation, process that we go through is based almost directly on the premise of that book. You said something interesting that I'd like to drill into, in terms of highest and best use. As real estate professionals, you look at a piece of land or an employee or a contractor or anything, right? And if you're like me, and I think you absolutely are, you're looking for what is the I don't know, call it a superpower. What is the superpower of the person, the human being standing in front of you? Move everything else out of their way so that they can go do that, right? So if it's an investor, it's, being a world-class doctor or an attorney or whatever. If it's an employee, I think our job as leaders is to clear the way so that they can clear out all the noise so that they can do what they do well. I was talking with another entrepreneur a few weeks ago, Nick Huber, and, one of the things that he said really stuck with me, which was that his job as CEO is to, create systems that an average person can succeed at. And, we all try really hard to hire superstars, but the fact is that there's a reality that.
Yeah. And, there's a reality. And, one of the things that I've also found is very helpful in that entrepreneurial space is to help educate the employee as to what their superpower is, right? Sometimes, Ed, you and I see things in people that they either don't think they are, right? So you're going to nurture that characteristic in them, or they don't think they want to be. Right. You got the guy that's really good at handyman stuff, but man, he sure wants to be, the superintendent and that kind of thing. And when you really show him, look, you're really good at this. And when you're doing it at your best, you're making as much or more as the other guy. And if you want, I can put superintendent of fixing stuff on your business card. Right. But if you can really help people to understand that this is their superpower and help develop them into a person that understands that superpower, one of the things that I really hate is drilling into detail. I look at it and I go, you know what, this is going to cost us $80 million. And I take that number and I go through the categories and I go, okay, excavation is going to be 1.6, plumbing is going to be 2.7. I don't need to get into the bath count, right? But there's that person in my organization that loves to make sure that we have 64 bathtubs, 64 toilets, that we didn't miss one, that we got the clubhouse, that they're all coming with shower rods, right? All of the things that need to happen. And they love nothing better than to be this deep in piles of papers.
Yeah.
And if you put me there, you'd put me in a straitjacket, right? I would literally lose my mind.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
A motivated seller just filled out your web form. If you call back within 5 minutes, you're nearly 4 times more likely to get that seller appointment. But delay your follow-up by even just 10 minutes? Forget it. You're toast. Ella Vista Connect calls that lead back in 60 seconds, qualifies them, and schedules your meeting. Find out how much slow follow-up is costing you. Free calculator at ellavista.com/underground.
Yeah, it's what in my previous life we used to call brain damage. Right?
Yeah.
It flat out stresses you the hell out.
And when you find that other person that feeds them and they really enjoy that, that's how you build the team. And it's no different with the investing world. You're finding that person that gets stressed out when they think about, oh my gosh, I'm signing on the loan. I just put myself $400,000 or $1 million in debt. And how am I going to deal with this and what's going to happen? And the tenant called, it's 2:00 in the morning. I got to be to work at 6. You take all of those things and you go, man, what is your superpower? Because we can offshore that. Yeah. We can, what would you say, delegate, outsource, or, just quit doing it,
right?
But the reality is there's ways around that. And when you really look at your life and go, this is my goal, this is what I need, this is what I want, this is what I'm prepared to do to get there, there's a big gap there that doesn't necessarily have to be it. And people forget that there's ways to do that. And with educating people as to that option and that opportunity, we found tremendous success in being able to get people excited about joining us because they truly understand it.
Right. Yeah. And, that's when you get people that become, they grow into, become passionate about what they're doing because they feel and they see that they're actually contributing in a significant way to, whatever team they're on, which is, as human beings, I think most people, they just want to be appreciated.
And they want to feel like they're contributing for sure. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Without a doubt. And so, so in terms of your team, what does your employee base look like versus your contractors, the folks you outsource to? Do you have a large team in-house or do you outsource? Do you tend to outsource?
We go back and forth. We're breaking ground on a 40,000 square foot industrial facility for an international stone dealer that we have a 10-year lease with. It's a syndicated deal. And so in that regard, we have an outsourced contractor, right? Okay. So I went into the marketplace. I interviewed 4 or 5 contractors. I found one that I really got along with, because at the end of the day, construction is about communication. And so I found a guy, found a team. He's got a good office. I like him. We're breaking ground that way. So I've got an internal manager here that's overseeing that process. We have in the past done our own property management. There's a scalability to that where you get to a point where it makes sense to hire outside, and then it again makes sense at a certain unit count to bring it back inside. Yeah. And we've gone back and forth on that. I think ultimately bringing it inside is the best option, just because there's ultimate control. Right. If you're less than 2,000 units, you're probably not going to make money on it. It's not going to be a money-making venture. Right. However, when you can be completely in control of your NOI and act and answer to your investors as the owner of the property management company, doing absolutely everything, including something that may be detrimental to a property management company, but in alignment with what the investors want, it's a much better scenario for everybody. So we've gone back and forth on that. But, construction is so crucial to the timeline, to controlling things, especially where most of what we do is ground up. It's hard for me to relinquish control, even though I'm not going to be the one that wants to get in there and drive the actual nails.
Yeah. But, and there's a happy medium there too, right? You can still outsource and control. Yeah. You're just managing the manager as opposed to managing the project.
Correct.
And, as long as you have that partner that you trust, who's, their superpower is execution, it tends to work out real well. Yep. And it just comes down to clear communication.
Exactly.
Right. All right. So we've been talking for about 20, 25 minutes. It's time to get into the final 4. I ask every single guest these 4 questions. Hopefully they aren't stumpers. I'm sure you've heard some of them before. But, I'm always curious about, leaders and how they've grown and gotten to, the station in life that they're in, both professionally and personally. So I'm curious about, the advice that you've gotten. What is the best advice you've ever gotten, and who gave it to you?
The best advice I've ever gotten was from a guy that, and the way he said it was probably as eloquent as a 70-year-old man 20 years ago would have said it. But he said, I'd rather be standing on the street corner selling pencils than working for somebody else. And what that really meant was you have control of your own destiny. You have the ability to, whether it's sell pencils or computers or whatever, you are in complete control. And with that comes everything that goes with it. But the other side of it is you're 100% responsible for what happens with your life. Right.
Yeah. And, it's interesting that it's one of the things I was thinking about when I was hearing your answer is, like my wife and I are complete opposites. We're the classic opposites attract. And, she views having a job as security, where I view it as, a huge risk that I'm basically operating on the whim of the folks that work above me. And if they like me, I'm okay. But if something bad happens or, they stop liking me, go find a new gig, and there's no security in that. So I think I'm more of the pencil seller myself.
Yeah. And even in your wife's scenario, if she is in a place where she understands and she has built a replaceable employer, she's got a very marketable skill set. Yeah. She's in the driver's seat.
Yeah. She's an accountant. So
yeah. Oh, geez.
Yeah, she's okay.
Yeah.
And she's damn good.
Yeah.
The other thing that I've seen when I meet executives and business leaders is, they tend to be, leaders tend to be readers. And these days that doesn't necessarily mean a physical book. It can be audiobooks or webinars or conferences or YouTube videos or whatever. I'm curious about 2 things. One is, how do you consume information in your daily life? And also, who are you paying attention to these days?
I consume information through all of those channels. It's hard for me to get past a physical book. I retain so much more, but I do audiobooks, I do webinars. I'm a big proponent of master classes or, conferences. And, I really think that, we have such a fountain of information available to us. We can get podcasts on everything from healthy eating to end of life decisions to, real estate. And some people equate real estate to end of life decisions, but I think there's a lot out there, but I think the biggest thing, if I'm listening to podcasts, I'm listening to guys, I really like Joe Rogan just because he covers everything. He can bring you a wealth of information, but he is at a level where he's attracting the top of his game.
Yes.
And the other one I really like right now, as far as podcast goes, Ed Milet. That guy's got such a handle on self-improvement and mindset. And you can apply that to any facet that you're in. And I really, really appreciate those guys.
Excellent. Yeah. Finding a way to operate at your peak as long as possible throughout the day is
right.
Hugely valuable to someone, guys like you and me. All right. So last question. So if, when you're not talking about actually, let me take a step back. So if you had to start over, some guy in Connecticut waved a magic wand and said, all right, you get to start over, but you get to bring back all the knowledge that you have. What would you do differently at, that juncture where you were deciding to get into building houses?
I would go absolutely opposite of my friend that said to go sell pencils on the corner.
Okay.
I would go get a job, knowing what I know now and where I want to go. I would go get a job with the people that were doing it then. I would go get a job with them and I would learn everything I could from them. I would create the systems from I've spent 27 years becoming an overnight success, right? I think I could do it in 12, right? If I was given the chance. Because really getting inside somebody else's system and understanding why they do it. We do it this way because for the last 30 years, we've been improving our systems and we've got it to here. And glean that knowledge. And maybe I'm going to 2 or 3, but I would probably spend the first decade of my life working for people for the complete purpose of gaining information for myself.
Yep.
And then I would look at launching out from a much higher platform, I believe, than where I'm at right now, even when I was able to step away from that. And I know that's a little contrary, but, there's not a school for entrepreneurs. There's not a trade school that says, hey, come get a degree. And, you go get a degree in business management, but managing a business and owning a business are totally different. And how do you put all that stuff together? So that's what I would tell myself.
Yeah. I think that there's absolute value in that, you get to basically work for the people who become your mentors, right? I went to school and I was an English literature and mass communications major, right? You know how much I use daily? I do use a little bit of it, but it would have been so much better had I gone to work for construction, a large general contractor or, someone who's in the private equity space focused on real estate. That would have been,
exactly.
I wouldn't have spent 24 years slinging software. I would have spent 5 years doing that. And then, at 26, 27, I would have been out on the road, doing what we do instead of starting.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I hear you. All right, Shannon. So when you're not talking about real estate, what do you do for fun? What do you like to do?
This will sound funny, but I love tax savings and I love flying. And so I've been a pilot. I'm a 3rd generation pilot, but I started a flight school because I use Section 179 and every year I depreciate another airplane or 2. And so as my flight school grows, so does my tax savings and so does my ability to go have fun on the weekends.
And your plane collection, right?
That's correct. That's correct. And it's really justifiable when your accountant says it saved you money.
Yes. You gotta grow your business. You have a responsibility.
There you go.
Right on. Oh, that's awesome. So Shannon, as always, I've enjoyed our conversation today. If people want to get in touch with you or learn more about you, your business, any projects you have coming up, what's the best way to get in touch?
Easiest way to do that is just shannonrobnett.com. You can see the projects we have going. You can see what we've got on our plate. You can get a hold of my calendar if you'd like to book a 15-minute call. Just, get to know each other, maybe grab a tip or 2. I'd love to get to know your audience and see what I can do to help with the education process, maybe some connections, anything like that. So that's all there. It's at shannonrobnett.com. You can get to all my social channels and everything.
Okay, awesome. Shannon Robnett, thank you so much for your time today. It's good to see you, sir. And I'm looking forward to keeping in touch. Be well.
Thank you, Ed. I appreciate everything you're doing with this podcast and providing information to your listeners.
Thank you.
This has been the Real Estate Underground podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. It helps us grow. Until next time, happy investing. This has been the Real Estate Underground. Don't forget to subscribe. It helps us grow. Until next time, Undergrounders, remember your real estate journey begins with a simple step forward. Now get to it. Bye for now.